Hello, I'm Shankar.
And I'm Nikhil. This is Chai Across Generations. This is episode 25, Quarter Century Check-In.
Wow, Nikhil, I can't believe that it's been 25 episodes and this is the first time we're actually doing this in person together.
Yes, might be a surprise to some, but we are finally in person. Shankar, how are you feeling?
Pretty good. I guess we do have to explain to our listeners why we were offline last week.
Yes, yes, we do. They've caught us on this one. Do you want to tell them?
Yeah, I first got a text from one of our listeners asking if I was well and, that we're not dropped off the planet.
Yeah, to make
That
sure.
was very touching.
Yeah.
Well, we are both in Tarrytown, New York.
Yes.
We're doing the Advanced Coaching Intensive, which concludes our journey in coaching, which we started, I guess, in November 2022,
Yes.
and which is where we met, and which is the root origin of our podcast.
Yes. So we've been training to become executive coaches for 8 months. And like you said, this is where we met. We're back.
Yeah.
Back where it all began, where we first connected and then had the idea of a podcast and then eventually started doing one. I just want to go back to this listener that reached out to you.
Mm-hmm.
So is their assumption, if there's no podcast, he must be sick?
I don't know. Well, she has. She said that she so much enjoys listening to it on a particular day of the week, and that we didn't drop an episode last week, and so I was feeling pretty bad, to be honest.
Yeah.
But of course, we were scrambling, preparing for this advanced coaching intensive, which required so many requirements to be met.
Yes.
And so I know that we both talked about it in frantic texts as we were submitting our materials. And yes, we are sorry, dear listeners, but we are also happy to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. We're very happy to be back, and thank you for your concern.
Yes.
Shankar is healthy and well, from what I can tell.
And same here, right? At your end.
Yeah, and we are just at the end of this coaching program too. So shout out to the Columbia Coaching Program and cohort 29 that we're a part of.
Yes, we have shared with all of them now, that we have a podcast.
Yes.
And it's particularly significant for me, in some sense, this whole thing coming around full circle, being in the same geographical location where we first met and had the idea of doing this. And it's kind of, to me, it's very significant to see that dream or just something that was a wish come to fruition, and then we're coming back again. So
absolutely, yeah. You mentioned when we were here 8 months ago on our last night that we should do a podcast shortly after we met.
I'd forgotten about it.
Yeah, because we were having a good conversation about culture and generations, and at the time I wasn't sure. I was thinking, I don't know if I have much to say there, honestly.
That's true.
But then over a series of a couple months, we kept talking just offline, just as friends, and then I thought, hey, okay, this could work.
Yeah.
We like talking to each other, so the idea starts with you.
Oh, thanks, Nikhil. I'd completely forgotten about that. You throw out a lot of random ideas, and as you know, my daughter doesn't pick up on
Yeah,
all of this.
exactly.
So this was one of them that stuck, and that was good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is episode 25.
Mm-hmm.
25 is a big number, right?
Yeah, it's actually a significant milestone that I wasn't even sure that we were going to hit when we started out.
Yeah. It's funny. We haven't done a cricket episode yet, but in cricket, when they hit a century or a half century, it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
I always found, of course, those are big deals, but even when a player gets over 25, it's kind of like something's brewing.
That's true.
Something is happening.
Yep.
And I kind of feel that way here.
Yeah.
So we've got some juice now.
That's true. Yes. And that reminds me, we really have to do an episode on cricket. I don't think we can.
Well, hey, the World Cup is coming up in November, I think.
It's true.
I think it's in India again.
Probably a good time to...
Yeah. So we'll keep that one on the back burner for now.
Certainly.
But what we thought we'd do is reflect on this episode.
Mm-hmm.
We're 25 episodes in now, and so we thought we would look back on what we set out to do, how we're doing against those, and maybe where we're headed in the next 25 episodes.
Yeah, I like this idea. It's a quarter century point of reflection back and looking ahead.
Yes.
So to kind of bookmark this milestone.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Perfect. Well, let's start then with where we began. what were our goals and objectives when we started?
Yeah, I know. I know. In our first introduction episode, we actually talked about purpose and, or at least what we hoped it would achieve. And I seem to remember definitely exploring the generation gap and having intergenerational conversations. Particularly, I guess, parental relationships is what was coming to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then we talked about. I think I talked about hopefully being more forgiving and compassionate towards my parents, and and I think you had a broader perspective of across generations, not just parents, but also across, you know, other generations. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right about that. Wanting to understand other generations and their perspectives. So beyond my parents, but also learning from you, maybe learning from my grandparents' generation. And then the other goal we laid out was building the community. And it's funny because we went back and actually listened to the first episode, which is quite a trip, I must say.
Yes.
We talked about sharing experiences, normalizing experiences, right?
Yeah.
Since that first episode, we've talked about mental health, we've talked about marriage, we've talked about communication. And what I like is a lot of the things we shared were shared experiences.
Yeah.
You've had them, I've had them, others have had them in some form or other.
Right.
So I'm grateful that we are getting to at least put this out there. And if someone finds some solace in it or some similarity in it, that's a win.
Yeah, and I think there are two levels of this. So from actually my coaching experience, what I found is the first thing is we're in our head a lot and we're thinking about stuff. So the first opportunity is when you hear someone else talk about your experience, or when you read about someone else having a similar experience. That's the first stage of validation. The second stage is when you actually get to talk about your experience to someone else. And I think that's a shift.
Yeah.
It's even deeper, even more powerful. So hopefully this community, building the sense of community through the podcast, will help our listeners come in and talk to us and share their stories, and of course, as they to the extent that they feel comfortable with. But I think it kind of ups the level
Yeah.
of the conversation. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And this maybe leads into a question around how are we doing on this, right? And what feedback have we received? Like, have we been able to up the level, help hopefully ourselves and also our listeners?
I've been frankly overwhelmed in the most positive way with the feedback that I've seen, and also you've shared with me that you've received. So I think overall we've touched the hearts of many listeners, and more than that, they've come back with so much more in-depth analysis of some of these topics, provided greater context from their own lives, experiences that resonated. All that has been really wonderful. And to some extent, I almost feel a bit selfish that I've got to experience it.
Yeah.
But I would also like to share that with our listeners. But of course, respecting confidentiality and how much everyone wants to, put out there.
Yeah.
But that's been really gratifying.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think the feedback has been incredible. I've heard from lots of different friends and listeners when episodes have resonated with them, when moments have resonated with them, questions they had coming out of these episodes, and I feel like we're just starting to scratch the surface. I think what's been cool too is listeners saying, hey, you talked about X, you should talk to Y. Right? Yeah. This person can say more, but I'm so excited. We're connecting with more and more people, which is personally gratifying and hopefully also coming through on our podcast episodes.
I guess you're referring to the mental health topic, where we got some recommendations to talk to people who are active in that field. And,
yeah. And just in general, I think, or even just resources or other videos like, oh, you talked about this. Even people reaching out to say things like, oh, you talked about this experience.
Right.
I've had that experience, or I've had a version of that experience. And here's how I thought about it, or how I persevered through it, and maybe shared some resources around it.
Oh.
Even outside of the South Asian community. Had some non-South Asian friends reach out, especially with episodes like the Cousins episode, right? Of growing up away from your cousins across continents.
Right.
And I think in terms of what we've achieved, we have definitely explored the generation gap, and we'll continue to. We've improved, at least my relationship with my parents. They've both been on the podcast. I would not have guessed that necessarily when we started. Yeah. Your daughter's been on the podcast.
Yes.
Better understanding other generations. I've gotten a greater perspective from you for sure on several topics, including things like astrology. That one comes to mind from our marriage series. Where we have not done as much yet is build the community.
Yeah,
Would you agree with that?
I agree. Yeah. And I think maybe it's not incongruent with the idea that we first needed to achieve those two, and now we're really in a good place
Yeah.
to move forward with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think it's something we could do a lot more of, because as I hear from more people and we continue on, like, there's just so many more interesting people and experiences out there. We are
Yeah.
two people.
Right. But I think before we jump into that, I'm curious
Yeah.
to ask you this question. How do you think the podcast has changed you?
Whew. That's a big question.
Mm.
First, I would say the podcast has opened me up from a social perspective.
Mhm.
I didn't think I could just get on and host a podcast with you at the beginning of this, right? Neither of us have any podcast experience heading into this, but it's nice to come on and to try to find a balance between sharing, communicating, being vulnerable, being funny, hopefully, being engaging, in short. So I think it's changed what I think I can do and what I'm capable of in a social setting or in some type of group setting. It's gotten me to think deeper about these topics and to kind of take action. The act of inviting my mom and dad onto the podcast for Mother's Day and Father's Day changed my relationship with them and changed how much time we spend together and our understanding of one another. And it's challenged me, challenged my perceptions on certain topics, specifically around, like arranged marriage, like we talked about, astrology, and how astrology can have a role. So I've grown from that piece.
Wow. Thanks, Nikhil.
What do you think? What about you?
Much of it is actually very similar for me as well. So in some ways, I liken the podcast to actually finding my voice, a public voice. Sharing many of those things out there, sort of putting it out there for posterity is something that doesn't come easily, I think, to our generation, to my generation.
Totally.
And so I can empathize with your mom and dad for being initially a little reluctant to come out there and talk. It's almost felt like coming out on a dance floor to dance for the first time or to dance a new dance, to use a metaphor.
Right.
But it's been fantastic. I mean, I've been actually very pleasantly and positively surprised by how supportive our listeners have been to begin with. It has changed my relationship and the way I think about intergenerational conversations, for sure. I think a lot of the openness that you model, the principles of listening, how you frame a conversation, that's actually changed the way I talk to my daughter. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I learned a lot about that. And so it has been very productive. It's been very eye-opening. Made me look in places which probably were not my comfort zone, but shine a light on that, ask myself why I was maybe not willing to go there, and now I'm more confident to do that.
Yeah.
So it's been a big growth opportunity for me.
Yeah, you're making me also reflect and go a little bit deeper. I do think it's made me more open. We talked about courage and grace. Have more courage and grace with my parents and with other relatives. Since around the start of this podcast, I've also started calling my grandmother fairly regularly, which has been nice, and trying to have communications. It's this whole podcast has made me wonder, how many conversations am I actually having with people in another generation?
Yeah, you talked about this, and I thought it was very significant because it alerted me to the fact that when I was growing up, we had a lot of multi-generational family households, and there were a lot of opportunities, at least, to chat. And we had uncles and cousins, and it really, gave a reality to that idea that it takes a village to raise a child. But I'm also keenly aware that now that we're living in the US, that's quite different. We don't have that sort of setup in most places, and it's much harder. And so I think you're saying that it really opened my eyes to that.
Yeah, right. Like even in my own case, if we take work out of it for a second, because I will interact with a lot of people of different age groups at work, outside of work. Who do I interact with in a different generation? My parents? You? My grandmother? That's it.
Wow.
That's not a lot of people, right?
Right.
And I'd be curious for our listeners too to maybe reflect on that if they're curious about it.
Yeah.
Because that was a much lower number than I thought. I thought I would say, oh, I have a pretty diverse group of people in my life, and in some dimensions, yes, but in a generational sense, no. So that's maybe I'm looking forward to what can I do to continue to engage with older and younger generations, by the way.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I guess in my profession, I'm brought in touch with a lot more younger people, but even so, some of those interactions can be a little bit more deeper and meaningful, but some may not. And so
Right.
there's that too.
Yeah.
Like also the quality of the interaction and
Yeah.
how deep it goes.
I do want to make a point here too about you mentioned how it's not natural in your generation to have a public voice. And I actually think that's maybe more of a cultural thing. In addition to generational.
Right.
It might be especially more pronounced in your generation than mine.
Right.
But culturally, we're not taught to speak up, right? Speak out
Yeah.
publicly.
Right.
And this podcast is making me more a fan of the fact that we should have more South Asian podcasts,
Yeah.
right? There's space for lots of us. I would love to see, whether it's our listeners or someone else, there are so many ways, there's so many unique, beautiful, challenging parts of our identity and our experience.
Yeah.
And other people will have different perspectives. I would love to hear more of this.
Yeah, and in fact, some people even in our coaching cohort have asked me about starting a podcast and
Yeah.
how do we do it.
Right.
So that's nice.
Right. And to your point, it's not just the South Asian group too. It's just, in general, I think there's a place to share their distinct voice.
Right.
I'll be the first to admit there are a lot of podcasts out there. Maybe we've reached peak podcast. And yet there are still so many unique stories, perspectives to share.
Right.
To be honest, the idea of peak podcast was deterring me from starting this podcast in the first place.
Right.
There's already so many out there. What's one more going to do, right? But actually, there is a unique angle that I think we can bring,
Yeah.
and that I think a lot of other people can bring. So, I just don't want us to underestimate ourselves.
Absolutely. And it's the niche and it's the purpose. And if you can find the right niche and you name your purpose, I think there's still room for podcasts.
Yeah.
And it's just a form of communication at some level.
Right. Right.
I wanted to touch a little bit on how our interaction has changed through the course of the podcast.
Oof. Yeah. This is a good question. What do you think?
I think first off, coming back and sort of checking back with our cohort has given me a real sense of how, in contrast, we've kept in touch every week. So obviously it's deepened our friendship a lot more than if we'd not done the podcast. I think it's really taught us also so many different things, right? How do you work together? We've learned each other's characteristics, how to roll with each of our personalities and the things that are surfacing in our lives. And I know you've had a very, very busy time, and I really appreciate all the time you've put into this, Nikhil.
Oh, you too. It goes both ways.
And bailing me out when it seemed like a house on fire at my end. So, and I think it was a really wonderful experience to learn each other's skills, to see that we bring different also production aspects, which our listeners may not be aware of. It's not just the content, but the way we produce it, and also to sort of transfer those skills to each other in different ways. So I think you've been more proactive in picking up things than I have, but
yeah. Well, that's what the younger generation's supposed to do, right? No, I think it's a function of time, right?
Yeah.
You've had a very busy season of life, so I'm happy to pick it up. And I think that's one thing that has changed is we've learned to flex up and flex down when the other person is busy, which I appreciate a lot. I'll also say, before we did this podcast, we would just chat for an hour or two about whatever, right?
Right.
And it's different because now we chat on the mics and then we chat a little bit either before or after.
Right.
So you can't share as much stuff on just a one-on-one level because it's out there for public consumption,
Right.
a lot of it.
Right.
So that changes our interaction a little bit, but not in a way I would say is necessarily worse. It's just different.
Yeah, and in a way, I think it's we've gotten so much more closer, and we may not talk about all of that on the podcast,
Right.
And so there's that nice aspect as well. I mean,
Yeah.
we've gotten each other's families
Yes.
much better than we ever thought we would.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool.
That's very true.
Yeah. I count that as a huge blessing.
I agree. Yeah. A continual kind of coming together of our lives in a lot of ways.
Getting to know your parents, and that's
Right.
been a pretty high point of my last year.
Yeah, and getting to know Shivani, your
Yeah,
daughter,
yeah.
has been wonderful.
Yeah.
There's a lot of positives to be gained. Let's look forward.
Yeah.
Have our goals or objectives for the podcast changed? And what does that mean for the podcast going forward? The next 25 episodes.
Yeah, and beyond.
And beyond, yes.
So I think I don't think our fundamental objectives have changed,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion. I do think we both felt an urgency, or maybe if not, maybe urgency is a strong word, but a shared sense of purpose towards building community. And maybe I kind of feel you already had this idea, and I was maybe a bit slow to pick up on it, but now I have. And so I think we would like to do more of that going forward.
Yes,
Am I right?
I agree. I totally agree. I think our underlying goals are the same. I think we can execute better. We can do more in the sphere of building community. And I think we will do more in that regard. We have some ideas that
Yeah.
we're thinking through, but we'd love to meet more of our listeners in the virtual space or the in-person space if
Right.
we happen to be in the same area.
Right.
Would love to hear about all of your experiences, about questions you have, ways we can support one another, right?
Yeah, and I think our format may change a little bit in every episode. We'll still have episodes, of course.
Right.
But one thing we toyed with the idea was having a story format
Yeah.
or an interview format, which is more common in other podcasts.
Right.
But then there was the more explicit way of bringing in listeners, and you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we are toying around with the idea of maybe doing a meet and greet episode, which I have to give a shout out to one of our listeners up in Boston who suggested this idea. The idea is we would pick a Saturday or Sunday and have a Zoom link that anyone can join, and we could hang out for an hour or two. Get to hear from our listeners, say hello. Our listeners could meet one another. We could just chop it up and talk about whatever's on their minds.
Okay.
That would be kind of one form. Do you want to talk about some of the other forms?
Oh, yeah. The other idea I thought, which is a little bit more, you might say, coming from radio, is when we talk about a particular topic, it's always nice to get input from our listeners, like directly on the topic. So just a kind of a call in, but you could do it on Zoom. So we could have sort of a call in link where people could log in and then share a question or a comment or a perspective. And that would kind of round out the episode.
Right.
How does that sound?
Yeah, I like that idea a lot, to end the episode with a call-in, with other perspectives, with things we haven't considered, right? I'm sure we have listeners who are sitting at home listening and thinking, oh, you haven't talked about this yet, or what about this? And we'd love to hear those.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned a slightly different twist on that, which could be if listeners have topics that we've not covered,
Yes.
then it could kind of be a completely open format where they can jump in, talk for about 15 minutes, and we could share
Yeah.
our perspectives on that topic,
Yeah.
and maybe 2 or 3 of those, depending on how many jump on, would be stitched together and form an episode.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because in our current format, we can tackle one topic per episode, or sometimes it's one topic over 2 or 3 episodes.
Right.
But there are so many smaller, I don't even want to say smaller. There are so many other ideas that folks have mentioned that we absolutely want to get to,
Right.
but haven't yet. And so, if folks have energy, maybe hopping on the mics with them for 15 minutes. Let's chat about the question, about their core perspective. We can riff on it with them. I think that'd be a really cool way to do a lightning round or a hot potato round in some ways.
Yeah, I like that, because some of those topics do seem important, but we just don't seem to get around to them.
Right.
Because we have maybe such a long list and so much energy about some of the other ones. But that
Yes.
doesn't mean they're not important.
Exactly. I think you're totally right. Having the energy for it is so key in this format. Maybe that's something I've learned, and I think we've learned over 25 episodes.
Yeah.
And so when a listener suggests something, it'd be wonderful to have them on
Right.
to talk about it, right?
Yep.
Because that energy is coming from them.
Yes. And it may then actually spur our thinking in that direction.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, Shankar. So we've known each other now for 25 episodes. I mean, a little bit before that as well.
Oh, when your voice changes to that tone, I know something is coming, and I'm not quite sure if it's good or bad.
Oh gosh, another thing you've learned about me.
Yes.
The voice change.
Yes.
I wanted to end with something a bit fun.
Oh no. Okay.
So what's something fun or funny that we've learned about the other person?
It's how well you keep under wraps how much you've been caffeinating, for one thing, or at least try to. And I love to poke that bear, because you started off as a chai drinker.
Yes.
And I keep trying to tell you that in South India, coffee is king.
Yes, you do.
And yet I felt a bit guilty about that because I love chai too. And I gave up coffee, as you know,
Right.
Yeah, I used to be a coffee addict and I gave it up. But now you've started flirting with the dark side and drinking coffee occasionally, I found.
Yes.
I'm afraid that if I poke that bear, it may come back to haunt me because I've been sipping some coffee too occasionally.
I know. Yeah, coffee is... There's more to coffee than meets the eye.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay.
But I still am firmly on the chai side when I think you're firmly on the coffee side.
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
I'm still a strong believer. I like coffee because I love the smell and it brings back memories of drinking it. But then once I drink it, I think it's fairly strong.
Yeah.
And then I tend to have too much of it. And then I feel
Yeah.
anxious and jittery towards the end of the day.
Right.
Whereas with chai, it's always calming. It may not seem so
Yes.
attractive.
Yeah.
Aroma-wise.
I mean, I'll be honest, this might be a hot take,
Yeah.
but recently with chai, I've been feeling jittery after drinking chai.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Have you been? Shivani might have something to say about this. She thinks that I've kept increasing the strength of the chai to the
yeah.
point where it's like coffee now.
Yeah. Yeah, I've kept it consistent, but I'm finding as time goes on, if I'm already a little bit sleep deprived or anxious and I have chai, those feelings are typically amplified.
Are you growing older?
I think I might.
Maybe you won't qualify to be in your generation anymore.
I know, I'm aging out.
Right.
I'm aging out and just getting old, so yeah. There might be it. There's something there of, wow, I don't know if I love drinking chai, but I have to be a little bit more thoughtful about when and how. So instead of morning, sometimes I'll drink in the afternoon.
Seriously, yeah.
That's a little bit better when there's a gap in the day.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
So-
I think there's something to that.
Yeah. Can I share something funny about you?
Yes, please.
So, as we mentioned, this is our first in-person episode. So we've been hopping on a Zoom to record. And Shankar is nice enough to send out the Zoom link that we record on. It's very sweet of him, right? I always know I can go into my calendar invite, click the link, and he'll be there.
That last bit I'm not so sure about.
Except, as I understand it, Shankar, you like to use multiple different Zoom links. Or you have an existing Zoom link and the one you send me, and you may not have jumped onto the Zoom link that you sent me.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is, more than a few times, I hop onto the Zoom link, and I'm just stuck in a waiting room. The host will join soon, is what it tells me.
You give me a hard time that I put you in timeout. It's
Yeah.
not true. It's not intentional.
I'm in a waiting room, and I've just been put into timeout by my co-host.
It's
But-
not true.
And sometimes, there was one time where I thought maybe you were running late.
Oh.
And
But I was in another room.
You were in another room. So we were both in separate Zoom rooms. And I was like, okay, I waited, I think, 10 minutes.
Oh, Lord.
I thought, it's okay, he'll be here. He must just be busy. And I saw the loading icon for 10 minutes.
Oh no.
So I sat in the waiting room.
Oh,
And then we ultimately realized that we were in different rooms.
I'm sorry about that, but truly it does happen. Yeah. And this is nice, but today we can't do that. I can't do that to you.
Yes, you cannot put me in a waiting room today. But we've gotten better because now I know if I get the waiting room sign,
You text me.
I just text you and say, hey, I'm in the room and don't wait 10 minutes this time.
Yeah.
But it's funny because you also were in your own room for 10 minutes. You were in your own waiting room for 10 minutes there. So I don't know if either of us made out better there.
I was in my self-imposed timeout. But the funny thing is doing this together live is like night and day.
Yeah.
I don't know if I really enjoyed this so much.
Yeah.
It's going to be a little bit of a retraining to go back to the old
know.
format.
There's something about the energy in the room,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Is one of us going to have to co-locate? To where the other one lives?
What do you think? Middle of the country.
We'll just meet somewhere in the middle, yeah.
That's right.
Well, we'll have to do more of these as we have occasion to.
Yep.
Anything else you want to say as we look back on 25 episodes?
No, I'm really looking forward to the next set of installments of our episodes, and feel really energized after meeting you, Nikhil, and after all the fantastic feedback we've received from our loyal listeners and from the new listeners who've just started digging into our vault of episodes. So, to our dear listeners, we'd love to hear your feedback on the first quarter century of episodes and everything you'd like to see us do in the next 25. You can reach out to us on our Instagram page, Chai Across Generations, or email us at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
As always, subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a rating on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This really, really helps new people find our show, and we want to thank you all for listening.
So stay tuned for all the new formats that we're going to try out, and see you all next time.